been talking about fear. And last week, the first session that I did, we talked a little bit about what is fear and the fact that there is good fear and there is bad fear. And obviously, what we're going to be talking about is the bad fear. The good fear is, kind of making sure that you stay safe. And the bad fear is when you have constant worry and anxiety and, just all of the things that go along with picturing a bad future and different things like that. Okay. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about causes and consequences of fear. All right. So for causes of fear, when it comes to fear, we're three-dimensional people. Okay. We're spirit, soul, and body. And so we have fear is also triune, if you want to use that word, although we usually use that for the Trinity. But there's three parts of, three sources or causes or consequences of fear. And the first is physical. So you might have fear because you have a chemical imbalance. You might have the psychiatric disorder that is, one of those that's called like anxiety disorders. And these are things that are actually been diagnosed by a doctor, maybe a psychiatrist. And those of you who are counselors that are listening will know what that is, an anxiety disorder. You might have another physical cause of fear could be that you have a deficiency of serotonin. Serotonin is, I'm not a biologist or a psychiatrist or a doctor or anything like that, but serotonin generally makes you feel good about yourself, okay? You might also, a third physical cause of fear could be a genetic inheritance. You might have generational fear that's been handed down. And actually, so even if it's handed down spiritually, which we'll talk about a little bit, it actually begins to affect the people in the family physically. And so you might have an anxiety disorder that's passed down in the family, or you might have a serotonin deficiency. Part of your DNA sequence is missing something that it needs. So these are inherited conditions that we can have that can cause us to live in fear. Now, the second cause of fear could be spiritual, and that is demonic interference. And those are generally in the form of lies and intimidation. And it's really about fearful thoughts that are constantly being injected to your mind, okay? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But, if you're constantly being bombarded with fearful thoughts and fearful pictures, that could be demonic interference, okay? Then there is the third category of cause of fear would be emotional or your personality. But the emotional part really is about woundedness, okay? When we have wounds in our childhood or in our adolescence, or even perhaps as an adult, those wounds can become strongholds and they could be causing fears, and especially if we have unhealed childhood emotions. Trauma is a big source of fear, okay? Because you can have trauma. When we talked about anger and when we talked about shame, we talked about trauma. Trauma is the enemy's plan to mess people up, bottom line. And trauma is just something that's going to cause a lot of different problems. But if you have had trauma in childhood, or maybe as an adult, if you had trauma in childhood, it could result in low-level anxiety or hypervigilance. So again, just to recap about trauma, you can have a trauma that is bad things that happen to you, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, or you could have type A trauma, which is the absence of good things, okay? And the things that you needed that you did not get is actually traumatic. And it's always being on tiptoes. You've lived your life. Let's say you grew up with an alcoholic parent and you never knew who that person was going to be today. Was he going to be mad? Was he going to be calm? And so your life was walking on eggshells. And this is a definite cause of low-level anxiety and hypervigilance, and actually PTSD. But again, you can have PTSD if you were an adult and say you were in a conflict or you were in some kind of natural disaster, you can have this PTSD, which is just this, again, this hypervigilance, and you're jumpy, and anything can trigger, anything that reminds you of the bad event that you went through will trigger an anxiety episode. So if something bad has happened to you, you have this fear of it happening again, and you can have fear. PTSD doesn't have to necessarily be like a bad event, like being at a bomb site, or being in a car accident, or being in a fire. It could be rejection. You've been rejected. And so you can have this constant fear of being rejected, and it's just this, I'm walking on eggshells because I'm trying to make sure that everybody loves me, everybody accepts me, that I will not be rejected. And fear of rejection is a very, very deep fear. You could have learned fear from your family of origin. You may have been raised in a fearful home. I haven't told the story yet, but I'll probably tell the story. My mother instilled fear in me of swimming, of being in water. And she actually instilled a bunch of different fears in me. For instance, I was afraid of being in water, of having my water over my head. I was afraid of dogs. And then I was afraid of, being near big animals, like don't get me near a horse, whatever. And the weird thing is I found out when I was an adult that my mother used to go horseback riding. She was a good swimmer. She had a dog. I mean, all these things that she ended up having bad experiences with, and then was fearful for her children. I think my favorite story of having a fear instilled, or trying to instill a fear, was my mother, when my children were really small. My two sons are a year apart. So when one was 2 and the other one was 1, they were just walking. The 1-year-old was just walking. We would go to the department store, and there would be an escalator. And my mother, it seemed like she was trying to instill a fear of escalators into them, because she kept saying, be careful, be careful, be careful. And I was at that point, I did not want her to instill any fears in my children. And so I would say to them, you're fine, just step on the escalator, on the step, and hold on. And I refused to let her do that, but she could easily have instilled fear into them about that. She didn't make me afraid of escalators for some reason, but I don't know. Anyway, that's just a little aside story. All right, so if early bonds, you can have, fear and avoidance of pain in your motivational system as you're growing up. And we're going to look at that a little bit later when we look at a thing called love bonds versus fear bonds. But basically, you could just, if you're bonded with someone who's fearful, like a parent, then you start to develop those same kinds of bonds with fear instead of with love and in safety and calmness. So what are some of the consequences of fear? Again, they're physical, spiritual, and emotional. The physical consequences: chronically tense, okay? Because you have a brain malfunction. Your brain now functions in a fearful state. And if I understand correctly, the amygdala will regulate that kind of feeling, and whether you're going to have fight or flight responses. So you'll be constantly afraid. You're easily threatened by unfamiliar circumstances. You might even be irritable and unable to concentrate. In severe cases, you may have panic attacks, and that would include like PTSD. My brother-in-law was a Vietnam vet, and my sister-in-law would tell me that for the first few years after he came out of the Vietnam War, if any sudden noise happened in the middle of the night, he would get up ready to grab his gun or to grab some weapon to fight whatever was going to happen, because he was suffering from PTSD at that point. You could have an inability to make sound judgments. I have seen, what I've said to people, and I've seen this happen, is when you have a fear response, when you're in a situation where you're faced with something unexpected and you don't know what to do about it, your brain seems to shut down. And so what happens is that you cannot make a sound judgment. And so instead of being able to say, okay, this is happening, it's never happened before, what are some of the possible ways that I could do this? And, instead of being able to think that way, your brain shuts down and you just either you want to run away or you want to fight. So you have that fight or flight response. Okay. Fear, the scripture says that fear have torment, and that's an interesting verse. But I believe I was taught years ago, and I could be challenged on this, but I was taught that fear can invite infirmity and illnesses. Okay. It's as if fear opens the door to sickness. So, and I think physically you can have too much adrenaline being released in your body. And so you could, if you have too much adrenaline being released in your body, we talked a little bit about that when we talked about anger and how one of the responses to anger is for this adrenaline rush for you to be able to deal with the imminent problem. But when you have fear, I believe that there's also a release of adrenaline. And if that happens too much in your body and your body keeps getting flooded by adrenaline, it's not good for you. And so you might end up, it might be make you susceptible to heart attack, to headaches or migraines. I could tell you right now that when I was a single mother for a long time, and I didn't know this, but I was actually suffering from panic attacks. And the way that it manifested with me was that on Saturdays, I would work Monday through Friday. I would leave my home at 6 a.m. and get home at 6 p.m. And at 6 p.m. I have to feed my children, bathe my children, get them ready for bed. And by 9 o'clock, I conk out, and the next morning do it all over again. And that's Monday through Friday. And then Saturday was the day for me to do food shopping, laundry, clean the house, prepare for the coming week. And then Sunday was church. And so Sunday was a Sabbath, but I would cram everything into Saturday. But the consequence of that was that Saturday morning, I would have this migraine. And it wasn't until years later that I recognized that this migraine was a panic attack that I was having over all of the different things that I had to do. And the only way I could get through this was to just say, I can't do half of the things that are on my list of things to do. And so that was a really bad result. You could also have gastrointestinal issues, such as ulcers or irritable bowel syndrome. I actually got gastroenteritis after I had my second child. I had them a year apart. And I was also going through a very difficult marriage at that point. And right after I had, my baby was maybe a month old, and I ended up in the hospital. Back then they didn't do outpatient. If you were sick, they put you in the hospital, and they had me in the hospital for 5 days for absolutely no reason, because after a couple of days of treatment, I was better. But I had a terrible case of gastroenteritis. And I think it was because of all the fears that I had around being in such an uncertain environment with my husband and then with 2 small children. Okay, another consequence of fear is the spiritual, and that is the believing of the lies. Okay, so the enemy is trying to plant these lies in your head, which can be a cause of fear, but you're actually believing the lies. And so now you begin to misinterpret events according to those lies, and it increases your fears. And I just think that it's a terrible, the demonic attack is that you now are flooded with these what if questions. Okay, and those are like Grant Mullen, who teaches in this book, Emotionally Free. He says that these what ifs are like fear bombs in your head, and they're like invaders in your mind being shot at by a dark entity. All right. And these what ifs you are imagining the picture of what could happen if this thing that you're fearing is going to occur. And we'll talk in another session about how to deal and overcome with fear. But I always try to help people start to figure out, first of all, what are you picturing? What are you imagining? What is the what if, and let's deal with that. Another consequence of fear is this fearful lifestyle, because you've been raised in this fearful home. You start to avoid any risks. You avoid making decisions. You avoid new situations, and you avoid change. And then you try to control your environment. You try to control the people around you. You try to manipulate them to do what you want them to do, so that you can not have any kind of a fearful surrounding happening. When we have fear, we feel like the only way to deal with that fear is to control our environment. Okay. And so it leads to a lot of manipulation. You can become very overprotective of your children and your loved ones. I believe, for instance, my mother, the way that she raised me was not because she had not gone through different things, for instance, having a dog, but she had a bad experience with a dog. And I don't know if this is really the case because my mom's passed away now, and there's so many things I couldn't ask her in the last few years of her life because she had dementia. But I understood that she lost a child right before she had me, the child that she was pregnant with before she ended up having me. And my sister tells me the story that there was an encounter with a dog. And so I think she fell somehow because of this dog. And I think she attributed the loss of the child to that. I'm not even sure about those circumstances. But now she had become so fearful that she became overprotective of me. Anytime we were near a dog, I mean, her fear response and just holding me back would make me afraid. And it was the same thing with water. Okay. And then there is, when you have a fearful lifestyle, you've learned this behavior, you become, it's really hard to mature, because what you're doing is you are now developing fear bonds rather than love bonds. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit. Because, and from this book that I really, really recommend to you, and I've said it before, Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You by Jim Wilder and Company, they say becoming mature requires bonds between people, because those are the foundations upon which maturity is built. If, for those of you who have ever done Elijah House, there is a developmental stage. The first stage is basic trust. And you can't have fear and trust together, okay? So if you're trusting in people, you can develop good bonds with them, love bonds rather than fear bonds. But if you cannot trust, then you're going to have, it's going to stunt your maturity. And I'm just going to read from some of the book, Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You. It should not come as a surprise that fear motives creep into our lives as we fail to mature properly. We learn our motivation during infancy through bonded relationships. Whatever emotions our parents use to motivate us become our internal source of motivation during life. If these early bonds form love and closeness, they serve us well. But if they form fear and avoidance of pain, our motivational system stays immature. All right. Now, there is, if you're watching this on YouTube, there should be in the comment section a little link that says, click here for resources to fear, that I recommend about reading about fear or learning about fear. Or if you're watching, or if you're in this discussion group that we are actually going through, I've given a link. And in the bottom of, if you scroll down to the bottom of that page, there is a supplement that says love bonds versus fear bonds in relationships. And these are about something that we call soul ties. And, you know, soul ties are the connection. It's the connection, the way God has created us to connect to one another. And we are to connect to one another in love. Okay. And so we can, if we are raised in a fearful childhood of, you know, that kind, then we are going to have ungodly soul ties of fear rather than godly soul ties of love and trust. And so the table that you could find in that resource list is about love bonds versus fear bonds. I'm just going to go kind of quickly through it. You can read it for yourself. And then next week, I will talk a little bit about how to change those fear bonds into love bonds. So if you have a love bond, it's based on love. If you have a fear bond, it's based on fear. If you have a love bond, it's desire driven. And if you have a fear bond, it's avoidance driven. If you have a love bond, you grow stronger when two people move closer together. And even when you move away from each other, you still have that bond. But with a fear bond, it only grows stronger by moving closer or by moving farther away. In the table that you will read, it has the explanation for all of these. I'm just going through the headings on these. Okay, with a love bond, we can share both positive and negative feelings. With a fear bond, we cannot share both positive and negative feelings. With a love bond, we are encouraged to act like ourselves. And with a fear bond, we're actually inhibited from acting like ourselves. With a love bond, we have truth pervading the relationship. And with a fear bond, deceit and pretending is required. With a love bond, we continually grow and mature and as people. And with a fear bond, our growth is restricted and stunted. And finally, with a love bond operates from the front of the brain or the joy center and governs how do I act like myself. And the fear bond operates from the back of the brain, like I said, and governs how do I solve problems. So I'm really not great with these brain things, but my understanding is that when I was talking about the shutting down of thinking, your prefrontal cortex will allow you to do some thinking and reasoning, and you're not going to get overwhelmed. But if you're operating out of your amygdala, it's going to be fight or flight kind of responses. All right. So anyway, that's just a little bit of that. Next week, I will talk a little bit about overcoming fear and how to change fear bonds into love bonds. In the meantime, I would encourage you to look up a list of fear bonds versus love bonds, and maybe next week when I do talk about it, I'll go into it a little more detail. But if you want to reflect upon this, what I would say to you is I want you to think about, what do you believe is the cause of fear in your life? Okay. Like for me, I understand that a lot of the fear that came from in my life was from my mother just kind of overprotecting me. And then my oldest sister, who was 8 years older than me, was, she was in charge of me when we all went out together and my mom was not there. And she had a lot of fear that she had gotten from my mother. And so she also was overprotective of me. So I was kind of surrounded by fear. So I really understand where fear came from in my life. And then also I had some issues with rejection, and I had a lot of fear of rejection. So I understand that. So think about what possibly could have been the cause of fear to be operating in your life, and what was the result of that fear. So with me, I had to really work on overcoming my fears, and we'll talk a little bit about that again next week. All right. So have a blessed day.